Tom, I began life as a working scientist, but I didn't last very long. But my love of science, of course, has lasted, and I've followed the fields. But my obsession with the philosophy of religion and does God exist has not abated. And so the natural feelings that one has from that background is to constantly explore this relationship, which is historically and today sometimes a very antagonistic relationship. You have come at it from a different perspective than most that seek harmony. I personally don't like harmony because I like truth. And sometimes truth is inharmonious.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. But so the reason I came at it from a different angle is that you don't need yet another person to talk about or to try answer the question, how does one reconcile science and religious belief? But because personally that question has never meant anything. I mean, I've never felt, if someone, me, a Christian believer and a scientist, if there were real conflict between these two modes of truth, that the conflict would be running right down me like an axe cleaver, and I would feel two people. But I've never felt two people. I've never thought two people. So when science hits issues like this, the methodology is to ask, well, are you asking the right question? Perhaps you're not asking the most fruitful question. So I started thinking, well, is this, how do you reconcile the right question? And I thought, well, actually, no. Within the kingdom of God, just for one moment, suppose one suspends disbelief and believes. Just suppose, try it.
Yeah.
Then think what the question is. Well, the question is, what do I do with science? Science then becomes a gift, not a problem. The question is a teleological one, a question of purpose. What is science for within the kingdom of God?
When you're saying kingdom of God, you mean the fact that this is God's universe.
Yeah.
You don't mean in the specific future Christian sense.
No. I mean here and now. I mean here and now. What
right.
we do as Christians, what are we supposed to do? How do we serve in this world?
Right.
And then I thought, well, why have we got ourselves in a problem like this? And I thought, these theology and science debates. And I thought, well, maybe it's the theology that's the problem. Maybe it's out of date and just completely incommensurate with the scientific advances. And then I started reading some theology and talking with theologians and realizing this is smart stuff, and this is perfectly capable of taking modern science on board and thinking creatively and supportively about it. And then I thought, well, maybe it's the science, because there are these very scientistic, the sort of people I mean, who think that science is the only way of thinking, and logical positivism.
Scientism, as we say.
Scientism, and maybe that's the problem. And it is a problem, but it's not a majority problem. Most scientists are far more subtle and educated than that. Then I realized that the problem is not with the theology or the science. The problem is with the word "and." And I know that sounds rather banal. How can "and" be a problem? But as soon as you lay out the debate, I'm going to be talking about rich and poor, north and south, east and west. There's a little painting of a white line down the middle of a tennis court that goes unnoticed. And is that the right conjunction? And I realized it wasn't. That one way of articulating my question is, what is a theology of science? Meaning, within a theological worldview, what is science for? How do we adopt it? How do we develop it? How do we deploy it to our purposes of being?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, but it's a different question.
Yeah.
So you're asking an interesting question, and but from a very different, shall we say, epistemological or way of knowing the world position. Because your position is that God exists. I'm sure God exists. I'm 100%. That's my basic. And if that is the case, I mean, if subjunctively, because I'm sure it's the case, well, then what is I'm going to put some words in your mouth.
Yeah, I'm going to take them out again.
See if you like the taste. And so I'm sure God exists, and now I have to look at things. I have to look, why as human beings, and what is the purpose of science? If God exists, why would we have this capacity? That's a legitimate, interesting question, but it's not the same question.
Well, it might be. I think so. So a couple of things here. Are scientists ever sure about anything? Am I sure you exist? It's pretty likely, but am I absolutely sure? Well, no. We could be living in a lovely little illusion of our own little solipsistic world. So no, we make hypotheses. My current hypothesis is that broadly speaking, the traditional Christian worldview is true. But can I assure you that I will be 100% sure next year? Well, no, because it might be not hanging together. So,
third-person proof is very different than first-person proof. I understand that, and even first-person proof, you can never be 100% sure.
Let me say something about your first question about this non-linearity. In science, I find this all the time. You want to address a particular question. You're getting nowhere, so you ask a tangential question. You say, this theology of science, this purpose of science, this theological, it might sound like a completely different question, but when you ask it, it turns out to be a path to answer the question you first started with.
So I could see that. In other words, if you can develop it richly, that if you have a world that is a world that God is in, for sure, and you can see a purpose of science in terms of enriching our understanding and appreciation of creation and all of that. And as you get deeply into that and feel that viscerally, then maybe that'll help you infer back that maybe my original hypothesis was correct. I mean,
that's also true.
Is that a better taste in your mouth?
That tastes gorgeous. I love that. I mean, that's haute cuisine.
Okay, very good. So I mean, I can appreciate that, but it's still a different question. So you can't substitute the theology of science for theology, I'll take it better, it's not quite a conjunction, but I'll say versus science.
Right. Okay.
Because I think you need to put them more in conflict. So what I like to do, even though I hope that you're right, or I hope there's some kind of God. I'm not sure your kind of God is my kind of God, but that's okay. We can worry about that later. Let's just start with, does God exist, and then we can worry what kind of God or something. But I would like that to be the case. But I would like to. I would agree with you that searching for consonance or that and in the middle, I don't feel comfortable with that. But I go to the other side. I say I prefer versus. I prefer conflict. I prefer war, because I want to see. I want to stress test. During the financial crisis, you stress test banks by going through financial analysis of their balance sheet. I want to stress test science, stress test theology, see how they work.
Okay, but you're hopping onto a narrative for which I never thought I would ever be grateful to your new president's, or your president's press secretary, her name is, who invented this category called alternative fact. And this versus story is a narrative which really only began in the 19th century. So this is why history is important here. A couple of books by people like Draper and White with titles like The Conflict Between Science and Religion. Right. I think this is an invented conflict. Now, you can stress test it by pushing on it and asking whether it's a real conflict. But here's the thing.
It wasn't a historical accident. It came because scientific advances undercut the fundamental way of thinking of theology in terms of creation and Darwinism. It wasn't an accident.
No, but if you think, if you articulate theology and science as competing epistemologies, as competing different ways of knowing, then you're going to way into trouble. I'm a radical here. Now, I know that's the premise of Ernan McMullen and who's behind this lovely conference that we're at, but I don't think that's right. So I'm going to radically push back on this and say, look, the reason we're in trouble is because we've assumed these are competing epistemologies. Think of how this is helped by the question or by one possible answer to the question I asked. If it's science, a theology of science, then doing science might be what you do epistemologically in a religious worldview. Science could just be a part of working out one's theistic religious faith. And if that's true, the verses doesn't even arise.